Picture an American oil tanker, flying the Stars and Stripes, sailing out of a West Coast port sometime in the late 1930s, fully loaded, bound for Yokohama. Nothing unusual about that at the time, it's just commerce, one more shipment in a trade relationship that's been running for decades. But that oil is about to be refined into fuel for warships, for the aircraft engines of a naval air force, for the very machinery of an empire that is, at that exact moment, already fighting a brutal war of conquest in China and quietly planning for something much larger. For years, the United States kept selling oil, steel, scrap metal, aviation fuel, the raw industrial ingredients of a modern war machine, shipped by American companies to a country that both American diplomats and American intelligence services increasingly understood was building toward a confrontation with the United States itself. And then, less than 4 months before Japanese planes appeared over Pearl Harbor, Washington finally cut it all off, a decision that Japan's own military leadership would later cite as one of the direct triggers pushing them toward war. This is the story of how America helped fuel the very fleet that would attack it, and the slow, reluctant decision to finally stop. To understand why this happened, you have to understand just how dependent Japan actually was on foreign, and especially American, raw materials by the 1930s. Japan is a resource-poor island nation. It had almost no domestic oil production of its own, extremely limited iron ore, and virtually no rubber. Everything its rapidly industrializing military and civilian economy needed to function, fuel for ships and planes, steel for weapons and vehicles, scrap metal to feed its foundries, had to come from somewhere else. For most of the 1930s, that somewhere else was overwhelmingly the United States. American exports to Japan during this period included massive quantities of petroleum products, machine tools, iron and steel scrap, copper, and aviation gasoline specifically, the kind of high-octane fuel needed to power modern military aircraft. Some historical estimates place American oil as supplying roughly 80% of Japan's total petroleum needs by the late 1930s, an almost total dependency on a single foreign supplier for the single most critical resource any modern military machine requires. This wasn't some minor or incidental trade relationship. It was, for years, one of the load-bearing pillars of Japan's entire capacity to wage war. While this trade continued largely uninterrupted, Japan wasn't simply stockpiling resources for some hypothetical future conflict. It was actively fighting one. Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931, establishing a puppet state there, and in 1937 launched a full-scale invasion of China proper, opening what would become one of the most brutal conflicts of the entire pre-war period. Reports of atrocities committed by Japanese forces against Chinese civilians, most infamously during the Nanjing massacre in the winter of 1937 and 1938, were widely reported in the American press and generated real public outrage and sympathy for China within the United States. Tensions between the two countries flared briefly into direct violence, even before any of the later trade restrictions began. In December 1937, Japanese aircraft attacked and sank the USS Panay, an American gunboat clearly marked with American flags, as it evacuated civilians on the Yangtze River near Nanjing during the fighting there. 3 Americans were killed and dozens more wounded. Japan formally apologized and paid compensation, describing the attack as a case of mistaken identity in poor visibility, and the incident was diffused diplomatically rather than triggering any immediate break in relations. But it stood, even at the time, as a stark early illustration of just how close the two countries already were to open conflict, years before Pearl Harbor, and how much political will it took on both sides to paper over that near miss and keep trade running. And yet, for years afterward, American commerce with Japan continued largely as before. This wasn't because American officials were unaware of what was happening. Reports on Japanese military conduct in China circulated widely through the State Department and were covered extensively by American newspapers. It reflected instead a genuine internal tension within American policy, a strong isolationist current in domestic politics that opposed entangling the United States in overseas conflicts, powerful business interests that profited directly from the Japan trade, and a slow incremental shift in official government thinking that took years to translate into concrete action. Public opinion in the United States during the late 1930s remained deeply divided on the question of intervention abroad, still shaped by the lingering trauma and disillusionment of American involvement in the First World War barely 2 decades earlier. Organizations like the America First Committee campaigned loudly against deeper entanglement in either the European or Asian conflicts, arguing that American commerce and American lives shouldn't be risked over foreign wars that didn't directly threaten the United States. That domestic political reality gave officials in Washington real reason for caution before taking dramatic economic action against Japan, even as reports of atrocities in China continued to generate genuine public sympathy for the Chinese people specifically. The tension between those two instincts, sympathy for China's suffering and reluctance to risk American economic or military entanglement over it, shaped the slow, incremental pace of the eventual American response for years. The first serious sign that Washington's patience was wearing thin came in 1939, when the United States formally terminated its 1911 commercial treaty with Japan, the long-standing agreement that had governed trade relations between the two countries for nearly 3 decades. The move didn't immediately stop trade. It simply removed the treaty's legal protections, giving Washington a freer hand to impose future restrictions without violating an existing international agreement. That freer hand started getting used the following year. On July 26, 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an order restricting export licenses for a range of strategically significant materials headed to Japan, including iron, heavy steel scrap, various types of lubricating oil, and, critically, aviation gasoline, the high-grade fuel Japan's naval and army air forces depended on most directly for their combat aircraft. This wasn't a total embargo. It was a licensing system, giving the American government discretionary control over what could still be sold, and it represented the clearest formal signal yet that the trade relationship was being deliberately used as diplomatic leverage rather than treated as simple apolitical commerce. The pressure escalated further just a few months later. In September 1940, effective October 16th of that year, Roosevelt imposed a formal embargo on exports of scrap iron and steel to any destination outside of Britain and countries in the Western Hemisphere, language carefully constructed to specifically exclude Japan without naming the country directly, in a way that might read as an overtly hostile diplomatic gesture, even though everyone involved understood exactly which country the restriction was primarily aimed at. Japan's government reacted with genuine alarm. Scrap steel was a critical input for Japanese industry, feeding directly into the foundries that produced everything from warship hulls to rifle barrels. Japanese officials publicly protested the embargo as an unfriendly and provocative act, and privately, within Japan's military and civilian leadership, the move reinforced a narrative that had been building for years, that the Western powers, and the United States specifically, intended to strangle Japan's economic and military development rather than allow it to become the dominant power in East Asia that its leadership believed it was entitled to be. Despite the growing restrictions, oil continued flowing to Japan through most of 1941, remaining the single largest gap in Washington's escalating pressure campaign. That changed dramatically after Japan moved troops into southern French Indochina in July 1941, occupying territory that put Japanese forces within striking distance of British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines, a clear signal of further southward expansion that alarmed Washington and London alike. In direct response, Roosevelt signed an executive order on July 26, 1941, freezing all Japanese assets held in the United States. The practical effect of the freeze, combined with subsequent bureaucratic decisions about how licenses for any remaining transactions would be processed, was that by August 1941, the flow of American oil to Japan had effectively stopped entirely. What had begun as a series of targeted incremental pressure tactics over the preceding 2 years had within a matter of weeks hardened into what amounted to a complete oil embargo, cutting off virtually overnight the supply source that had been meeting roughly 80% of Japan's petroleum needs. This is usually where people start asking, okay, so was the embargo the right call or not? And honestly, there's no clean answer. Curious what side you land on. Like the video if you're still with us, and let's get into what Japan actually did next. For Japan's military planners, the embargo transformed an already tense strategic calculation into something close to an existential deadline. Japan possessed substantial but finite oil reserves in storage, and without new imports, Japanese naval and military planners estimated those reserves would be exhausted within a year or two of sustained wartime consumption. A modern navy without fuel is not a navy. A modern air force without aviation gasoline cannot fly combat missions. The embargo placed Japan's entire military capability on a countdown timer, and Japanese leadership increasingly framed their choices in stark terms. Either back down from the expansionist ambitions that had defined Japanese foreign policy for the preceding decade, or seize the resources. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies specifically needed to become self-sufficient, by force if necessary. Japanese officials referred to the embargo in internal deliberations that survive in post-war historical records as tightening what one American commentator later described memorably as the noose around Japan's neck. Diplomatic negotiations continued through the autumn of 1941, with American officials, most notably Secretary of State Cordell Hull, demanding Japan withdraw from China and Indochina as a condition for lifting the embargo, terms that Japan's military leadership, having already invested years and enormous resources into its continental expansion, viewed as functionally impossible to accept without a total loss of face and strategic position. By the autumn of 1941, Japan's civilian and military leadership had converged on a conclusion that would shape the following 4 years of Pacific War. With the embargo in place and diplomatic negotiations failing to produce American concessions, Japan's only realistic path to securing the oil and raw materials it needed was a rapid military campaign to seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, particularly the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, before existing fuel reserves ran too low to support such an operation. The strategic problem with that plan was the American Pacific Fleet, based at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, sitting directly astride the flank of any Japanese advance into Southeast Asia and possessing the naval strength to potentially cut off and destroy a Japanese task force engaged in a resource grab campaign to the south. Japanese naval planners, led most prominently by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, concluded that a decisive, crippling first strike against the American fleet at Pearl Harbor was the only way to buy Japan the time it needed to seize Southeast Asian resources and consolidate a defensive perimeter before American industrial power could be fully mobilized against it. The attack, launched on December 7, 1941, was explicitly conceived not as the opening move of a war Japan expected to win outright against the full industrial capacity of the United States, but as a way of buying time within a resource crisis that the American embargo had directly created. Yamamoto himself, notably, was one of the more clear-eyed voices within Japan's own military leadership about the long-term odds of this strategy. Having spent time studying and serving in the United States earlier in his career, he had a first-hand appreciation for the sheer scale of American industrial capacity that most of his colleagues in Tokyo lacked, and his well-documented private and public statements from this period show a man genuinely opposed to war with America, warning repeatedly that a prolonged conflict would end in Japan's defeat. A line often attributed to him, along the lines of promising to run wild for 6 months to a year before losing confidence in the outcome, has become one of the most repeated quotes of the entire war. Though historians have never been able to verify it appears in any of his surviving letters, and it may actually originate from a screenwriter decades later, rather than from Yamamoto himself. What isn't in dispute is the substance behind it. Yamamoto viewed the Pearl Harbor operation less as a guaranteed path to victory, and more as the only available option to buy Japan's military leadership time and strategic breathing room, given the resource clock the embargo had already started running. Whether or not he ever said those exact words, the war's actual timeline validated the thinking behind them. The tide of the Pacific War began turning against Japan at the Battle of Midway, barely 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Inside the American government itself, officials weren't blind to the risk that the embargo carried. Some diplomats and naval planners privately worried that cutting off Japan's oil supply entirely, rather than maintaining a slower, more gradual pressure campaign, risked cornering Japan's leadership into exactly the kind of desperate, immediate military action that eventually followed. Ambassador Joseph Grew, the American ambassador in Tokyo at the time, sent cables back to Washington throughout 1941, warning that Japan's military leadership might respond to mounting economic pressure with a sudden, dramatic military strike, rather than the negotiated concessions Washington was hoping to extract. Those warnings, preserved in the historical diplomatic record, make clear that the possibility of a Japanese attack wasn't some unthinkable surprise dreamed up only in hindsight. It was a scenario at least some officials in direct contact with Japan had explicitly flagged as plausible in the months leading up to it, even if the specific target of Pearl Harbor itself came as a genuine tactical surprise. There's a genuinely uncomfortable historical irony sitting at the heart of this entire sequence of events, and it's worth stating plainly rather than glossing over it. For years, American oil, steel, and scrap metal had directly supported the industrial and military buildup of a country that was, simultaneously, committing well-documented atrocities in China and steadily planning further territorial expansion across Asia and the Pacific. The material that flowed across the Pacific in those years didn't stay in civilian hands. It fed directly into the tankers, aircraft engines, and steel production of the very naval air fleet that would eventually launch the attack on Pearl Harbor. This doesn't mean the embargo itself was the sole or even primary cause of the war. Japan's leadership had already committed to a course of continental expansion years before the embargo took full effect, and the decision to attack Pearl Harbor reflected a broader strategic calculation about resources, timing, and the perceived inevitability of conflict with the United States that predated the final oil cutoff by years. Japan's military had, after all, invaded Manchuria back in 1931, nearly a full decade before the oil embargo took effect, demonstrating an expansionist trajectory that owed nothing to American trade policy at the time. The embargo accelerated and compressed a collision course that was already largely set, rather than manufacturing one out of nothing. But it does mean that American policy in the years leading up to Pearl Harbor was more tangled and more consequential than the simple, familiar narrative of an unprovoked surprise attack against an innocent, uninvolved bystander tends to suggest. The United States had been, for a substantial stretch of the preceding decade, one of the primary suppliers, keeping the machinery of Japanese military expansion running, right up until the final months before that machinery turned directly against American forces in Hawaii. Worth being precise here about what actually changed and what didn't. The embargo didn't create Japan's expansionist ambitions out of nothing, and removing it wouldn't have simply dissolved a conflict that had roots going back to Japan's invasion of Manchuria a full decade earlier. What it did do was compress an already tense strategic timeline into an urgent one. That's the picture that emerges clearly from Japanese wartime planning records and post-war testimony from the officials who lived through it, transforming a long-term rivalry over influence in East Asia into an immediate resource crisis that Japan's own military leadership concluded could only be resolved through rapid military action. The tankers that had once sailed peacefully across the Pacific, loaded with American crude oil, stopped running in August 1941. 4 months later, Japanese carrier aircraft launched from a task force that had crossed much of that same ocean, and the fuel powering their engines that morning had, in a very real sense, been part of a supply chain the United States itself had helped build and sustain for the better part of a decade. The years immediately following the embargo would go on to demonstrate just how accurate Japan's own resource anxieties had actually been. Cut off from American oil, Japan poured enormous military effort into seizing the oil-rich Dutch East Indies within months of Pearl Harbor, successfully capturing the fields, but then facing a second, less publicized problem for the rest of the war: getting that oil safely back to Japan itself, across supply lines that American submarines increasingly targeted with devastating effectiveness as the war progressed. By the final year of the Pacific War, Japan's Navy and Air Force were once again critically short on fuel, this time with no foreign supplier left to turn to at all, a resource crisis that had never really gone away. only been temporarily and violently postponed by the very war the original embargo had helped set in motion. Next on this channel, we're following those same scarce resources to their final spectacular ending. The single largest battleship ever built, sunk by American aircraft in under 2 hours. Subscribe so you catch it when it goes up. One more thing before you go. Historians still genuinely disagree on whether a different American policy in the years before 1941 could have avoided this collision entirely. What's your read? Drop it in the comments.